So do you actually do anything of your own free will? You might think, yeah, I decided to watch this video, and then I started watching this video, and now here I am watching this video, and that seems like a free action you chose to do. What else would be necessary for freedom? Well, in this video, I'm going to argue that we don't have any free actions, that we don't have any free choices, and that anything we actually do never counts as freedom. This might not seem that important to you, but our entire practice of holding someone morally responsible is based on the idea that they acted freely. If no one acts freely, then how can we really hold someone morally responsible? So in this video, I'm going to offer two arguments to argue that we don't act freely. The first one is based on the idea that all of our actions are determined by our desires, and we don't actually control our desires. The second argument is that everything you do is determined by things in the past, way long before you were born, and so also not something you can control. So anyone who wants to maintain that we still act freely are going to have to find some flaw with either one of these arguments. Arguments that we don't act freely, let's first look at an argument for maybe why we do act freely. So, just intuitively, we might think we act freely because many of our actions seem to have the mark of freedom. We examine our options, we decide what we want to do, and then we decide to do that. So we can frame that argument as follows. The argument from freedom. FR1, sometimes you perform actions after deciding to perform that action. FR2, if one performs an action after deciding to perform it, then one perform that action freely. FR3, so some of your actions are performed freely. So FR1 here seems obviously true. There are at least some times that our decisions and our actions correspond with one another. And FR2 says that if there is this action-decision correspondence, then that action was free. So consider yourself again. You decided to watch this video, and choosing to do so and then doing so felt like a free action. However, FR2 does not say that all of our actions are free, just merely that some of them are, and specifically the ones that are corresponding with our desires. So let's consider this thought experiment here. So this is called hypnotic action. Tia is on the run from the law, and she knows the cops are hot on her trail. She is also a master hypnotist. As she passes John on the street, she hypnotizes him and plants an irresistible post-hypnotic suggestion. Whenever he hears someone say freeze, he will fall into a hypnotic trance and tackle that person who said it. Just then, Kabir, the cop, arrives on the scene, sees Tia, and shouts, "Freeze!" Jordan then tackles him. So when we think about this thought experiment, it's clear that Jordan did not decide to tackle Kabir. He fell into a trance, and when he came out of that trance, he was on top of Kabir. Jordan's action was not free. He did not choose to do that. So FR2 is getting it right in this case. But now let's consider another thought experiment. This one's called hypnotic decision. So Tia is on the run from the law, and she knows the cops are hot on her trail. She is also a master hypnotist. As she passes Colton on the street, she hypnotizes him and plants an irresistible post-hypnotic suggestion. Whenever he hears someone shout freeze, he will grow very angry with this person and decide to tackle them. And then he tackles them. Just then, Kabir, the cop, arrives on the scene, sees Tia, and shouts freeze. As a result of the post-hypnotic suggestion, Colton gets angry at Kabir and consciously decides to tackle him and then tackles him. So when we think about this thought experiment, it's clear that Colton did not tackle Kabir of his own free will. It might have felt that way to Colton from the inside. In other words, it might have seemed as though he was acting freely and that he could have done otherwise. But however, whether he likes it or not, it was actually Tia's hypnotic suggestion that caused Colton to act. Now, you might think that hypnotic decision might seem unrealistic, but that still is not going to prevent us from using it as a counterexample to FR2. This is a person who seems to have decided to do something, but still is not acting freely. This shows us that FR2 is false, and it gives us reason to think that our concept of free action is in doubt. So you might be thinking, why are Colton's actions in hypnotic decision not free? Well, the natural answer is that although he made the decisions, the desires that motivated him were not under his control. It was not under his control whether he had an overwhelming desire to tackle Kabir. This suggests that freedom does not only require that we choose what we're doing, but also that our desires are something that are under our control. So this argument can be formalized as follows. Here we have the desire argument. DS1, what you choose to do is always determined by your desires. DS2, you cannot control your desires. DS3, so what you choose to do is always determined by something you cannot control. DS4, if what you choose to do is always determined by something you cannot control, then you never act freely. DS5, so you never act freely. So desire in this argument is going to be any kind of wanting. It's going to include passionate yearnings for things, but it's also going to include, something less dramatic, like I want new socks. All right, so now with that in mind, let's think about the different premises. Let's first look at DS1. So think about what you had for lunch yesterday. Let's just suppose that you were in the U-Sen and you were deciding between Subway on one hand and Panda Express on the other. Well, what made you decide to go to one or the other? Presumably, it was your desire. You had a strong desire for one or the other. Now, maybe you decided to stay home and make food at home as opposed to going out and getting food because you had a stronger desire to save money as opposed to going out and getting food. So notice that DS1 is not saying that you'll act on every single desire you have, but rather more that our choices are a function of our desires or a function of what we want and how much we want them. All right, so now let's look at DS2. DS2 is pointing out that we don't always choose our desires. So you might be a pre-med and you might have chosen to be a pre-med student, and you might have chosen to be a pre-med student because you like helping people. And maybe even this is your passion and you decided to follow your passion. But did you ever decide to become passionate about helping people? The answer seems to be no. It doesn't really seem to make sense. In the same way that you didn't really choose to desire Chinese food over sandwiches, or vice versa, and you didn't choose to like cats over dogs. We don't really choose our desires here. And so it seems that whatever desires we end up with are something that are out of our control. All right, now finally, let's look at DS4. The motivation for this is going to come from the hypnotic decision case we were talking about earlier. So even though Colton did choose to tackle Kabir, he did not do so freely. And the best explanation we have is that his desires were out of his control. In other words, because his choices were being controlled by something, which was outside of his control, he did not act freely. All right, so generalizing from that, we get DS4. If what you choose to do is always determined by something that is outside of your control, then you're never acting freely here. All right, so you might be tempted to reject DS4 here and say, insisting that even though these choices are determined by something that are outside of our control, they're still your choices and they're still your desires. And that's enough to count them as free. However, hypnotic decision is supposed to be clear that Colton was not acting freely, yet he did choose to tackle Kabir, but he did so because of his desires that were not under his control. Okay, so the point is that just because one's actions are a result of one's desires does not mean that they are acting freely. All right, so now we're going to consider two possible objections to this argument. First, we're going to consider rejecting DS1 because one's strongest desires don't always win out. And the second objection we're going to consider is possibly rejecting DS2, in that there are ways of actually controlling our desires. Right now, this is a good time for you to stop and reflect. Can the argument from undesired actions be defended against the objections that I've been raising? Are there any better examples of undesired actions that will escape these objections? So let's suppose you're in bed and your alarm's going off. It's going off for your 8 a.m. class. Now, you are super cozy, snuggled up in bed, and maybe you went out the night before, so your head's not feeling very great, and no part of you wants to get out of bed. But yet, somehow, you get out of bed and you drag yourself to class. So this might initially seem as a counterexample to DS1, but it's not. So to see that, let's think about the argument behind this idea first. So this is known as the argument from undesired actions. UA1, your desire to stay in bed was stronger than your desire to get out of bed. UA2, if your desire to stay in bed was stronger than your desire to get out of bed, then what you choose to do is not always determined by your desires. UA3, so what you choose to do is not always determined by your desires. So UA1 might be true. You might have zero desire to get out of bed. But UA2 here seems false. Your desire to get out of bed was not overpowered by your desire to stay in bed, but rather was overpowered by some other desire. It seems like in this case it was overpowered by your desire to get a good grade in this class. If you didn't have that desire, then you probably would have stayed in bed. So this is just another case of our actions being determined by our desires. This and other similar counterexamples to DS1 are going to fail for similar reasons. So suppose you want to try and disprove DS1 by making yourself a banana and smoothie omelet for lunch and eating the whole thing even though you think that it's gross. Again, you're trying to prove that you're doing something that's not determined by your desires. So you're not motivated by a tasty lunch here. However, this does not show that your action was motivated by something other than your desires. Rather, it shows us that despite your desire for a tasty lunch, you would rather desire to disprove DS1. So another case, let's say you try and flip a coin, right, to decide what you're going to eat for lunch, Subway or Panda Express. And then you let the coin decide, right? So then you're not choosing, but that's not, or your desire is not choosing, but really your desire is still choosing. You have a desire to honor the outcome of the coin flip rather than, again, eat what sounds tastiest to you. So you might still want to push back on DS1 here. Suppose that you're in a situation where your arm twitches and it spills some water, right? Well, surely you had no desire to spill that water. This shows us that what you do is not always determined by your desires. Well, it's supposed to, at least. Yet there's a problem. It's not a problem for DS1. Since DS1 does not say that what you do is always determined by your desires, but rather what you choose to do is always determined by your desires. Since you're twitching and you're not choosing to spill the water, then this is not going to be a counterexample to DS1. All right, so DS2 says that we cannot control our desires, and that's because we have no choice in our desires. However, one might object that just because we cannot control our desires does not mean that we don't have control over them. For example, suppose someone's been watching or reading some philosophy and they want to become a vegetarian, but they love eating meat. They have a desire to be eating meat, so much so that they don't like eating meals without it. So what are they supposed to do? Well, one option is that they can, go on YouTube, look up some videos of factory farming and how the animals are mistreated and slaughtered. And over time, they'll condition themselves to become nauseated every time they see or think about meat. And so then they'll stop desiring having, meat with their meals. Again, think about an addict who checks themselves into rehab to, change their desires. So they're trying to change their desires for alcohol or drugs or some behavior. And so, yeah, the idea is that even if we never choose the desires, we can still change our desires by taking some actions, again, checking ourselves into rehab. So these are known as desire-defeating actions. All right, so now we can use those formulating an argument. So this is the argument from desire-defeating actions. DD1, your desires can be changed by performing desire-defeating actions. DD2, if your desires can be changed by desire-defeating actions, then you can control your desires. DD3, so you can control your desires. This argument is really not that convincing though. By deciding to perform desire-defeating actions, you have to want to do them. Ultimately, whether you choose to do a desire-defeating action or not is determined by whether you have a strong enough desire to perform that desire-defeating action. So to see how this is a problem for this argument, let's set aside free will and let's just think about the connection between ability and control. So let's just suppose that I'm trying to get across this river, and to get across the river there is two ferries, and one of them is faster than the other. And you have to stand in one line, and in that line there's one person who decides which ferry you go on. And so yes, I have the ability to get across the ferry faster, but it's not really in my control. It's completely within the person deciding which ferry you get on. You don't know how he decides. It's not like you can stand in one line and that will get you in the fast lane. It's like there's one lane and he decides which ferry you go on. So there is an ability to get across the river faster, but there's no control over whether you do go across the river faster. So there's a difference here between ability and control. And so an analogous statement can be said about desire-defeating actions. My desire can change by performing a desire-defeating action. So in other words, DD1 is true. However, it's not up to me to perform that desire-defeating action. And so I can't control my desires to perform my desire-defeating action. And since I have no control over performing a desire-defeating action, then I have no control over my desires. In other words, DD2 is going to be false, and so the argument here is going to fail. All right, another time to stop and reflect. Can the argument from desire-defeating action be defended against the objections that I've been raising? So now let's focus on the second argument that you have no freedom. This argument is going to come from the thesis of determinism. Roughly put, the idea is that everything that happens and will happen in the future has already been guaranteed by what has happened in the distant past. So determinism can be stated a little bit more rigorously in terms of physical necessitation. To say that one state of the universe physically necessitates another means that it's logically impossible for one to occur without the other occurring. So then determinism can be formulated using this idea of physical necessitation. So it can be formulated as the thesis that all present and future states of the universe are physically necessitated by the previous states of the universe in the distant past. And specifically here, we're thinking about ones that are even before you were born. Okay, so to give you a little bit of an idea about how determinism works, let's think about like those rhymes we used to use when we were kids to make a decision, like who's going to get the last cookie. So here in the textbook we have this rhyme called 1 potato, 2 potato, and it goes 1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, 4, 5 potato, 6 potato, 7 potato, more. All right, so if you don't really remember how these work, maybe you never use anything like this, but so you line the people up, and let's just say we have Blake, Garrett, and Jason in that order. And you start the rhyme with Blake, and you say, you point at Blake when you say 1. And each time you reach another number word, then you're going to point to the next person. So if you point at Blake at 1, then when you say 2, you're going to move on to Garrett. And when you say 3, you're going to move on to Jason. And when you say 4, you're going to point back at Blake. When you say 5, it's going to go to Garrett. 6, it's going to go to Jason. 7, it's going to go to Blake. And more is going to be on Garrett again, it seems like. So once you reach more, then that person is the person who's going to get the cookie. That's kind of the point. But you probably realize, I think I was about 10 or so when I realized that these rhymes were, manipulatable in a certain sense. Like, if you know how many positions are in the rhyme and you know how many people are there, then you know, like, oh, if I'm in the second position and there's 3 people and we're doing 1 potato, then I'm going to get the cookie. So I want to make sure I'm in that second position. And if everyone else realizes that, then everyone's going to want to be in that position, and the rhyme's just not going to work, which is pretty much exactly what happened when I was a kid. So what you're seeing is that the order of people plus the rules of 1 potato, 2 potato are going to necessitate a unique outcome. And it's going to be the same outcome every time you run it through. If there's always 3 people, the second position is going to be the one who always keeps getting the cookie. So analogously, determinism is going to try and say the same thing. So past states of the universe plus the laws of nature are going to necessitate a unique future. And as just with the rhyming count, given the setup plus the rules, there's only one way things can go. So determinism claims that the laws of nature dictate how the states of the universe give rise to the next states of the universe. So if we knew all of the laws of nature and we had this perfect description of everything going on in the universe, then we could accurately predict everything that's going to happen in the future. All right, so before we go on, we need to make 2 points of clarification. First, there's a difference between determinism and the concept of fate. Fate is the idea, it's often used in terms of like love and romance and soulmates. So like 2 soulmates were fated to meet each other. They might say they were determined to meet each other, but those mean different things. And so fate is going to be this idea of like, they're going to meet, but we're not quite sure how. So, maybe they met in the grocery store when they were, buying, the snacks they were bringing to the party. Or then they actually met at the party. Or maybe they didn't meet at the party and they met, years later. What really happens is like they were just fated to meet. At some point in their lives, they had to meet, but it wasn't actually determined when or where or how. Now, determinism, in contrast, is going to say that there is one and only one way that things could have been. And that was determined by the previous states of the universe and the laws of nature. Right, so the second clarification for determinism is that determinism does not claim to be able to pinpoint the determined cause for every single decision that we make. Like, why did I choose to put on this jacket today? There's a lot going on. Rather, the idea is that the entire state of the universe, hundreds of years ago, with its mind-boggling complexity, physically necessitated the states of the universe every single day leading up until this morning. Which includes everything like me putting on this jacket, right? So another way to think about it is thinking about it like a pool game. So let's just suppose that the cue ball hits the 7 and the 11 ball, and the 7 ball knocks the 9 ball towards the pocket, and the 11 ball goes off the rail and then comes back and it hits the 2 ball out of the way just in time for the 9 ball to go in. All right, so it's really hard to say exactly like which ball caused the 9 ball to go into the pocket. But given like the arrangement of the balls on the table and given how the balls were struck, it was still determined that the 9 ball was going to go in based on the laws of nature and based on the original setup, things like that. The point is that the universe is supposed to be like this game of pool. There is there's not one thing that we can point to in the past that said, like, I'm going to wear this jacket today, but rather the universe is one giant pool game with atoms chaotically bouncing off of each other, but they're also doing so in accordance with the laws of nature. So according to these laws, and given the previous states of the universe, we can reliably predict what the future states of the world will be, or so determinism tells us. So you might already be seeing how determinism is going to be a problem for free action. And so we can formulate that in the following argument, the argument from determinism. DT1, determinism is true. DT2, if determinism is true, then you are never able to do otherwise. DT3, if you're never able to do otherwise, then none of your actions are free. DT4, so none of your actions are free. We've been explaining what determinism is without really getting into why you should think that determinism is true. So why should you accept DT1? Well, let's think back to the pool table. Now imagine that the cue ball is heading towards the 8 ball, and I tell you everything that's relevant about the state of affairs going on there and all of the laws, physics going on that are going to be relevant in figuring out whether the 8 ball is going in. And then I ask you, is the 8 ball going to go in? And, without determinism, we have no real way of actually figuring out whether that's going to be the case. we can only answer that question if determinism is true. The initial positions and the laws of nature are going to tell us what's going to happen next. And if we don't have that, then we have no way of telling what's going to happen next, or at least no principled way of telling what's going to happen next. It could be that the 8-ball could go in, or maybe for all we know, if determinism isn't true and anything could happen, the 8-ball could fly off the table in a crazy, unpredictable way, or maybe it just might explode. Who knows? If determinism isn't true, anything could happen. So because of that, it's at least our principled way of determining what's going to happen in the future. So DT2 says that if determinism is true, then you could not have done otherwise, anything other than what you're doing. So yesterday, it might have seemed as though you could have gone somewhere else for lunch, or maybe you could have made it at home, but you didn't actually go there. In other words, it might have felt like you could have done something otherwise, but you couldn't actually have done it. Determinism says that it's not actually so, and if determinism is correct, it's not actually so that you would have had the choices. And if determinism is correct, then you could have never actually eaten somewhere else yesterday other than where you actually did eat. So DT2 seems plausible, since if determinism is true, then our actions and our consequences of things that we cannot control, like the previous states of the world and the laws of nature, are going to tell us that we are powerless to control what actions we choose to do. So DT3 is going to say that free action requires us to have multiple options to choose from. If we don't actually have these multiple options to choose from, if these options are taken away from us, then we're not really choosing. And if we're not really choosing, then do we really have free will? The idea is supposed to be no. So as the name suggests, this argument is going to rely on determinism. And there are two ways of rejecting determinism. First, you might think that mental states are not determined by the past or the laws of nature. Second, you might think that there's genuine randomness in the universe. So the first idea is that determinism is only about the physical world. It doesn't actually tell us about the non-physical world. Some people think that mental states are a part of this non-physical world. So mental states might just be brain states, but and so physical, and so also subject to this determinism. But let's just suppose, for argument's sake, that mental states are non-physical. Well, still our bodies are physical. And so our bodies are going to be subject to determinism, which means that our bodies, everything they do, they could have done otherwise. Everything our bodies do have been determined. And everything we do, other than thinking, is going to be something that we do with our bodies. And so since all of our bodily actions are determined and we couldn't have done otherwise, then we really have no free action. All right, so the second way of trying to push back against DT1 is to say that the physical world is not determined. And so the idea behind this one is that there is actually some genuine randomness in the physical world. So quantum mechanics is going to back up this idea, saying that some things happen completely out of random chance. So this leaves open the different possibilities for what will actually happen next. So you might reject this interpretation of quantum mechanics, but that's not really wise for those of us who aren't physics majors. So let's just suppose that it's true and this is actually correct, and there is actually genuine randomness in the world. So it's going to tell us that DT1 is false. If there is randomness in the world, then determinism isn't going to be true. But again, this is going to be a short-lived victory because this isn't going to actually still give us free action and free will. So to see that, let's suppose that there was only a 30% chance that you would actually sit down and watch this video. There was, let's say, a 25% chance you'd go for a walk, and a 45% chance that you would, take a nap. And by random chance and by random fluke, you decided to watch this video. Well, that doesn't really sound like free choice to me. So to think about it, let's go back to the moment when you decided to watch this video. Well, if I took you back to that moment 100 times, that means that 30 times you'd watch this video, 25 times you'd go for a walk, and 45 times you'd take a nap, assuming that we actually had the percentages correct. So no matter what you choose, it will happen because of a random occurrence. And since it's happening because of a random occurrence that's not under your control, then the actions are still not under your control and you still have no freedom. All right, so we can formulate this idea as the following argument, the doomed regardless argument. DM1, if an action is determined, then you could not have done otherwise. DM2, if you could not have done otherwise, then your action was not free. DM3, so if an action is determined, then that action is not free. DM4, if an action happens randomly, then that action is not free. DM5, every action you perform is either determined to happen or it happens randomly. DM6, so none of your actions are free. So a lot of these premises have already been motivated, so we'll just give a quick sketch of the argument here. So DM1 is going to say that if your actions are determined, then you have no control over the factors that are determining your actions, because that's the past and the laws of nature. The idea behind DM2 is that freedom requires us to have the ability to choose to do otherwise. So DM4 is going to say that things are random. If things are random, then we could not have chosen to do otherwise. That's like, if things were random, then we couldn't have actually chosen to sit down here or chosen to go on a walk, where it's just randomly happening. We're not actually choosing. And so DM5 says that all of our actions are either determined or they are random. For this to be false, we would have to have some other type of action, something that's not random nor determined. But I can't really think of anything else. The idea goes that if an action is underdetermined, then it must have been a random chance. And so the idea is if it's determined, if it's not determined, then it's random. And if it's not random, then it seems to be determined. So DM6 is going to follow from these premises. The idea is that since there are these only two types of action, and neither one of them leads to free action, then it stands to reason that none of our actions are free. All right, now here's another chance for us to stop and reflect. Premise DM5 of the doom regardless argument says that every action is either determined to happen or random. Is there really no middle ground between these two options? Approach is to not deny determinism, but rather to insist that determinism is compatible with free will. This is known as the compatibilist strategy. The compatibilist strategy is going to accept DT1, but that means that they're going to have to deny DT2 or DT3. So let's look back at the argument for determinism. DT1, determinism is true. DT2, if determinism is true, then you would never be able to do otherwise. DT3, if you're never able to do otherwise, then none of your actions are free. DT4, so none of your actions are free. So first we'll consider rejecting DT2. The idea behind DT2 is that if determinism is true, then our actions are determined by things beyond our control, the distant past and the laws of nature. And so we could not have acted otherwise. So the reason for this can be formalized as the consequence argument. CQ1, if determinism is true, then what you do is always a consequence of the laws of nature in the distant past. CQ2, you have no control over the laws of nature or the distant past. CQ3, so if determinism is true, then what you do is always a consequence of things over which you have no control. CQ4, if what you do is always a consequence of things over which you have no control, then you're never able to do otherwise. So we get the conclusion here, which is actually going to be DT2, so that's the premise of the other argument, the determinism argument. So if determinism is true, then you're never able to do otherwise. So the idea behind CQ1 is that everything that is happening and everything that will happen is physically necessitated by the events in the past. And your body is a thing, and so its actions are going to be determined by the distant past and the laws of nature. So if determinism is true, then your bodily actions are physically necessitated by events in the distant past. Notice that this is a conditional statement, so you're not actually affirming that determinism is true. You're just noticing this connection between if determinism is true, then we aren't going to have this control. All right, so again, yeah, you don't have to accept determinism to still say that CQ1 is true. So CQ2 is obviously true. I mean, maybe if you had like a time machine, you could go back to the past and, change how things were, but other than that, like, we can't really change the way things were, and I don't think we can change the laws of nature. All right, so then we have the idea behind CQ4. Think back to maybe you had like an older sibling or an older cousin who like grabbed you by your wrist and they like moved your hands to your face and they said, "Stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself." Well, think about like why that's so frustrating. Part of why that's so frustrating is because you are being overpowered. You have no control over what you are doing. And generalizing from that idea, we can get CQ4. If you never have any control over the things that determine what you do, then you never could have done otherwise than what you in fact did do. So then from all of these premises, together we get our conclusion, DT2. And again, this is just the second premise in the determinism argument. Okay, so if compatibilists can't reject DT2, then they're going to have to think about rejecting DT3. To see how this might work, let's consider another thought experiment. This one's called hypnotic backup. Tia, the master hypnotist, is on the run from the law, and she hires Clay to tackle any cop who turns up. Concerned that Clay might betray her, Tia gives Clay an irresistible post-hypnotic suggestion to tackle any cop he sees, but which will kick in only if she triggers it by shouting abracadabra. When Kabir, the cop, arrives on the scene, Tia keeps a watchful eye to see if Clay is going to back out, but Clay comes through. He decides to tackle Kabir on his own, and without Tia having to trigger the post-hypnotic suggestion that would have forced Clay to tackle Kabir. So notice that Clay couldn't have done otherwise, but yet he still seems to be acting freely in this instance. Either he's going to tackle Kabir of his own free will, or he's not going to, or he's going to decide not to, in which case Tia would then trigger the post-hypnotic suggestion, forcing him to tackle Kabir. Either way, Clay is going to tackle Kabir. Just because he couldn't have done otherwise doesn't mean that we can't hold Clay responsible for tackling Kabir, because this seems to be like a free action, right? So the compatibilist could claim that this gives us good reason to reject DT3. So let's think about this example again, though. So Clay did decide to tackle Kabir, and he could have decided not to tackle Kabir. But since he did decide to tackle Kabir, we're inclined to say that his action was free, right? Well, if determinism is true, then Clay's decision was also determined, which means that he really didn't decide either. So we could then just, take this idea and revise our original argument from determinism. So the argument from determined decision. DT1, determinism is true. DT2 star, if determinism is true, then you are never able to decide to do otherwise. DT3, if you're never able to decide to do otherwise, then none of your actions are free. DT4, so none of your actions are free. DT2 star here is just as plausible as DT2. And DT3 star is no longer vulnerable to counterexamples like hypnotic backup. Alright, so now here's the last chance for us to stop and reflect. At the end of the last section, I said that the hypnotic backup case cannot be revised to serve as a counterexample to DT3 star of the argument from determined decisions. But is that really true? In this video, I made two arguments that we can never act freely. The first one is based on the fact that our actions are determined by our desires, and our desires are outside of our control. The second one is based on the idea that all of our actions are determined by the distant past and the laws of nature. Either way, our actions are determined by something outside of our control, and so we never act freely. So does this really matter? Maybe we don't act freely, and that's fine. We can just live with that. But if that's the case, if no one ever acts freely, then should we ever really be holding anyone morally responsible? Furthermore, if no one really controls what they do, does anyone ever really deserve praise or blame? So maybe we can shift our thinking here about punishment and rewards and things like that, and instead of being backwards looking, maybe we can think about them as forwards looking. So instead of, right now we seem to be punishing people based on what we think they deserve. They deserve it because of something they did or something they're blameworthy for. And so this is backwards looking. We are punishing them for something that they've done in the past. But maybe it would be a good idea to punish people or, threaten would-be criminals with punishment to the extent that it has a positive effect on their future behavior. So we should only punish people because it has the positive consequences, that there's going to be less crime or less, wrong or less harm in the future kind of thing.